Good morning and welcome to today's Lockdown Learning Free Business Continuity webinar. Today's webinar is on organising your response plan and will be presented by Gillian Logie, who is a senior consultant at our sister company PlanB Consulting. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. To submit your questions, all you need to do is type in the question box on the control panel to the right of your screen. These will be put through to Gillian at the end. You will receive a recording of the webinar later today in case you missed any of the content covered. So I think we're ready to begin, and I will hand you over to Gillian now.
Okay, good morning all. Thanks for that, Becca. As Becca was saying, my name is Gillian Logie. I'm a senior consultant at PlanB Consulting, and a large part of my role is to advise various clients in a whole host of industries on how best to roll out business continuity management systems and make sure that the plans that we're writing for our response teams are useful and engaging to the teams who are going to be using them. And that's really the focus of this webinar today. I've certainly got a lot of flexibility in how I approach presenting my business continuity plans, because different teams need different information and they need it at different times. So we want to make sure as far as possible that we're not locked into one particular way of presenting a plan, and we always keep in mind that it's about the user at the end of the day rather than ourselves who may be writing the plans. So just kicking off, first things first, why are we bothering with a plan at all? When we're approaching plan writing, what is it that we're trying to achieve? That's what our plan at the end of the day needs to reflect. Do we have a dictated format? Have we, downloaded it or Googled it from a source because we weren't quite sure on how to approach developing the plan, the type of content that we want in the plan? But we need to have a think about what do we want our users to be able to do when they pick up the plan, and use that as a starting point. I also want you to think about the teams themselves. So are we writing plans for departmental teams, operational business continuity plans? Is it a tactical team, an incident management plan, or is it a strategic team, a crisis management plan, or this gold level plan that we're writing? Different teams need different things from their plans, but there is commonality across business continuity planning, and that's a really good starting point to help us out with the basic generic information that we want to be available to our teams. But what's the unique qualities of each of our teams who are going to be using the plans, and are we making sure that the content reflects what they need? Now, a couple of things to keep in mind with that is, how much training are your teams actually getting? Now, we all have grand ambitions of how well trained we want our teams to be, how well exercised our teams are, how used they are to responding, how confident they are in their response roles. But do be honest with yourselves. If training is something that easily slides, if people make excuses and they can get out of training in any way, do we need our plans to have more of an element of hand-holding rather than being guidance documents or high-level documents, and we can assume a certain amount of understanding and learning? So do be honest with yourselves about what your teams look like. Also, what do they expect from the plans? Do they want a whole document, a step-by-step guide of how to respond, or are they quite happy with a summary of the information and then using their own expertise and their own skills to fill in the blanks? So do have a think about the team that you're writing for. And then, how useful is the content that you're including? What do the teams need to have available to them? What does your company documentation dictate that needs to be in a plan? Do you have a plan that has a lot of company information, that maybe has the assumptions, your objectives, a message from the CEO at the start of it, and we're scrolling through the first 3-4 pages before we even get to response information? Do we have an element of flexibility where we can perhaps move that to the back and keep very basic active response information at the front, as a team may prefer? And then have a think about commonality of your plans across your organisation. If you're from a large organisation, you've got several offices, maybe you have a global presence. Is there commonality in how your plans look? Could I, as a UK employee, easily move to your Singapore office and identify this document is an emergency response document? This document has some of the really basic key information that I would expect from a plan, plus the unique information that goes with the team and the area that I'm working in. So those are some things to keep in mind. And what I would like to get a feel for at the start here, we're just going to launch a quick poll, is are you tied into a corporate document structure that you have to stick to, or do you have an element of flexibility in how you might develop your plans and present them to your teams? So if you wouldn't mind just popping in a wee answer to the poll here. Are you defined by a corporate template? And you know, the alternative to that being that you have some flexibility in how you might approach your business continuity planning. So just give you a wee couple of minutes to complete the poll there, and then Becca will launch the results for us so I get a feel for the audience we have today. Okay, so most folk have a bit more flexibility than that, which is great, but bear in mind those of you who have a corporate template that you need to stick with. It can be a little bit of a running battle when it comes to response documentation, and I think for the department that you have that's in charge of putting that corporate document in place, a little bit of an awareness, if you can establish a relationship with them to say this is a unique document, this is not a standard document in the organisation, it has a very specific purpose and it needs to be useful and accessible as soon as we pick it up. We shouldn't be having to leaf through maybe 2 or 3 sections until we get to the useful piece that we need for our response. But I completely appreciate that sometimes we're limited. Okay, we'll move on from here. Okay, presentation. I'm just going to touch on this. Have a bit of a think to yourself about how do your teams want to see their plans. Again, think of the end user. Are we using hard copies and having an electronic version of that? It's a pretty traditional format, but it's well understood. Lots of people do like something to hang on to, something that they can maybe scribble over, make some notes on, tick some things off. It can contain a lot of information, and when we have an electronic version, it does allow us some 24/7 access should something happen. They're useful to have, but they can also be quite burdensome. We can end up writing in more content to the plan than we perhaps need or is perhaps useful. So that's something that we always have to keep an eye on. Are you using placemats? So a wee screenshot in the middle there. I find a lot of strategic teams and even some tactical teams are fans of having placemats to start off with, something around, you know, an A3 size. We laminate it, it sits on the table, just a reminder of some of the key information that's contained in our plans. So an overview of the response as a whole, perhaps our role-specific or our scenario-specific checklists and key communications that we need to carry out. These are really useful for experienced teams, those teams that you know don't need an element of hand-holding or that individual step-by-step response. So those that are well trained, those that are well exercised, or perhaps those who have taken part in a number of different types of incidents and they only need a basic reminder. With that sits behind the placemats will always be a more enhanced plan that we can pull on for more information, or once we get out of that initial emergency response phase, the first kind of 90 minutes or even up to the first day where it's a little bit frantic, and then as things settle down, we can pull out the more detailed plan and get into the nitty-gritty of the support that we need to respond well. Do you have the option to develop your own internal app or take on a piece of software that gives you app capability for your plan? The only thing I would point out with that is just make sure that it is adaptable to screen size. If you are using work mobile phones, then what is the screen size that you have? We've certainly worked with a couple of companies where it doesn't work on your slightly more old school small screen phones, and you need something that's almost the size of your face to be able to see the detail in the app clearly. But they are useful. We just need to always bear in mind that we need a backup for it should there be any IT interruptions at all. But it does mean that we can respond on the go, which is the way so many of us are responding, not only in this pandemic, but in general. Our teams don't tend to be in the same place all the time. So having something that we can all log into remotely, but we can still see each other's working within the app, that is very useful. One thing also to keep in mind with apps, or if you're getting your plans delivered by an external provider, whether that's an external piece of software or just a consultant, is there flexibility in how your plan is going to be presented, formatted, and the content included with it. Sometimes, again, we're a little bit bogged down with there's limitations to what the software can provide us with. So do keep an eye on that if you're ever choosing an external provider for your plans. Okay, so what do we include in the plan itself? The BCI Good Practice Guidelines has some really good information on some core content for the plans. That is really useful to have a look at that document to make sure that you're considering at the very least the different kind of content that your teams want to have. But do remember, the document is for a state of emergency. You have to account for panic, account for the adrenaline rush that comes with a call out, account for being woken up in the middle of the night if that's the way that your incidents could happen and your teams would be mobilized. Make sure that your plans are accessible for those types of conditions. Do think about telling a story with your plans. We learn at school about having the start, the middle, and end of the story. So do your plans have to start at the start with some information about what to do when we evacuate, or do we have a good, well exercised evacuation plan that we don't need to have that information immediately available to us? What do the teams need to do right now that they've been notified of an incident? Are there immediate actions to take, immediate communications that they need to make? Are there folk that need to be informed? Do we need to activate an app, send out an immediate message? Make sure that we know what our teams need to do right now. And then as we settle into our more incident management phase, what do folk need to know admin-wise around the response? Never forget the admin. There is no such thing as common sense when it comes to emergency response, unfortunately. So if we do need to, say, get a virtual meeting room set up, then have some content on how to do that. And never rely on people reacting the way that they would in a normal circumstance or when we're at business as usual. Do we want to have things like meeting templates to help guide and structure our response meetings? Do we need some communications detail to help get the message out to staff, to our senior response teams to notify them of what's going on, to any externals who need to be told at the start of an incident and as an incident goes on, details of how we're reacting and how the incident affects them. And then as we move through to the conclusion, how do we formally stand down? How do we recognise that it's the end of an incident or a crisis? What steps do we need to take? How do we debrief our teams and what comes next? reporting, lessons learned, actions taken. So do have a think about the story that you want to tell in your plans and arrange the content to reflect that. It is always worth engaging with the response teams who are going to use this plan to see what they need. Particularly pay attention to delegates. They're not always included in our trainings, they're not always invited to our exercises. So plan for the least trained responder, plan for the most nervous responder, and make sure that we've got some good detail in the plans that they can use, that they can hang on to, especially in the immediacy once a call out has been received. So what I want to do is just chat through some of the content that we have here. It's not everything and anything that you could possibly include in the plan, but I just want to have a look at that storytelling that we want to make sure that we're covering and what that might look like for where certain detail might appear in your plans. So the getting started phase. Now, I am a huge fan of checklists up front. Not everybody enjoys them because it can encourage a team to leap straight into the doing rather than the assessment piece at the start. And I really do appreciate that. But I particularly like checklists in plans where that initial notification, mobilisation, escalation isn't so much of an issue. So plans that might be very specific to environmental responses, the chances are we've got our incident teams up and running already. We recognise that it's a particularly severe environmental issue that we're facing, and we call in the expertise, the subject matter specialists from within our organisations to specifically look at that issue, whilst the incident team looks at the wider impact to the organisation. Those teams don't need to necessarily worry too much about the get up and go aspects of the response, and they can just crack on with actually fixing the issue. And I really enjoy checklists that they can just pull out the front of the plan and get on with it. But we do need to make sure that for teams who are receiving the initial notification of an incident, that to start off with, they understand how to assess the information. Is this of a severe enough issue that we have to get up and running? So we want our response criteria there to dictate to us, yes, you respond under these circumstances, or no, you sit back and you monitor and see if it can escalate into something that requires a response or can be dealt with at a local level. So we want to understand our initial notification piece, how we then escalate and how we mobilise our teams. So get that written down. Never assume that people know it. I've worked with really well-exercised and well-trained organisations who run frequent trainings for their teams, and still we bypassed the initial notification and mobilisation piece and went straight to what would we do business as usual. Oh, well, I would normally call, I'd normally call Kim, so I'm just going to call her anyway. She's not actually in my plan, she's not in our notification structure, but I'll just call her anyway. And then right at the start of the incident, you're already off track because you're not using process. So make sure the basic admin to get up and running is written into the plans so that, again, people can hang on to that, especially in the first 90 minutes of an incident. We do want to have a look at the settling down period, and there's a bit of administration that comes into this. But have a look at the team structure, so the team that's actually responding, and also how we communicate up the chain to notify the next senior team that we're up and running, so they can keep an eye on whether or not they need to mobilise as the incident escalates or not. But also remind folk that they can call on subject matter specialists as required. Remind them of the non-core members that they might want to pull into the team as well, because they won't have received the initial communication. Again, never assume common sense. Always give people a little bit more information than you would have on a daily basis to make sure that they are well supported throughout the incident. So how do we manage team meetings? Have a meeting template, have an agenda available to the team leaders so that they can structure meetings, but it also gives a heads up to those participating in the meetings about what's expected of them. That's really important. It can really help to settle folk down, avoid people shouting over each other or constantly interrupting each other, which is more and more important, especially in the situation we all find ourselves in, where we're doing video conferencing, we're using our Zooms, we're using GoToMeeting. We need to have very strict etiquette in how we're running our meetings. So some information around that is very, very useful. How, excuse me, how we're going to manage information going forward. So logging, make sure that we have detail in our plans about how to log, whether we're doing that electronically or we expect people just to take hand notes. What do we need to do personal logging wise? And then how is that then translated into a central team log so that we maintain our situational awareness? Everybody always has access to what's going on at a team level so that we can adapt our element of the response to reflect the evolving situation. So we do want to have some good information around that settling down period. Now, from a communication standpoint, good comms goes throughout an incident from start to finish. It can be really useful to have a tab available solely on comms, so that you've got this kind of one-stop shop that people can go to figure out who do I need to communicate with, how quickly do I need to communicate with them, what do they need to know, not what do they want to know. Everybody always wants to know way more than they need to know. And what are my communication channels to deliver those communications. I would also encourage you having a bit of information, just maybe a short few bullet points on how to design a message. Now, this isn't looking at your kind of corporate communication piece or your media piece, but it is how we speak to our staff, our different audiences of staff, those affected, those unaffected, those who are maybe travelling, those within teams who have been who may not be able to work as normal, those of our wider general staff, just to let them know what's going on. So some information about how to go about developing that message. It might not be done by a communications department, it could be done just as a team as a whole, pushing it out to their regular departments, but we want to make sure that the information is appropriate, that it's not too much, but that it is enough. So a little bit of guidance around that can be very useful. When we're talking crisis communications, usually you would find that that information sits externally to any central plan, including a strategic plan. You'd have a separate crisis communications plan. There's a lot of sensitive information in there, but also it needs a lot of detail, and we don't want to bulk out our plans with too many pages so that folk can never get round to reading them. We also want to have some information on staff welfare, and that can come into comms because we want to make sure that we prompt our teams and that they prompt line managers and those that they're interacting with frequently to check in on staff. We know, certainly in the situation that we find ourselves in now, that it is vital that we check in on staff to make sure that they're happy with the response, they understand what's expected of them, but also we monitor welfare and morale and be able to take actions proactively instead of trying to react to anything that goes wrong. We want a formal stand-down procedure. Give people a template, let them have a step-by-step process to recognising that an incident response can be stood down, debriefing the team and what comes next. Also check up on your team's welfare. Depending on the nature of the incident that they're responding to, it can affect people quite negatively, not necessarily in the here and now, but maybe a couple of days down the line, especially if there's been staff injuries or, heaven forbid, fatalities. You have to check in on your team, so make sure that we have some information available to us that we can hang on to in order to prompt that check-in. Reporting is key. Make sure as part of your stand-down procedure that we know how reporting is going to be managed, who is going to take responsibility for that, and the timings around it. Maybe have a template included in your plan or a link or reference to where we can find that reporting. And anything that we don't need to have in the body of the plan or that we want to very easily be able to kind of rip out either physically from a plan or be able to access very quickly from an app, have that in an appendices, reference it throughout the plan, but have it at the back so that we can immediately go to that page and start using it. So I'm thinking things like scenario-specific checklists or role-specific checklists, maybe a summary of your business impact analysis so that we know what our key time-sensitive activities are and how quickly we need to get them back up and running and the resources that we need to do that. Any templates for logs that you want your teams to complete, wallboards for information management, maybe an action tracker in there, and any supporting documentation that sits alongside the plan that we're using. So these ones especially will vary for the different levels of planning, the different teams that are involved in the response. We need to make sure that they're always useful to them. Keep in the back of your head using names in a plan, but also contact details. We have a number of GDPR concerns around that, but also have a think about how frequently are we actually updating these plans? How current are they going to be 3 months, 6 months down the line? Do we have good program management in place to make sure that they're always kept up to date? I would always encourage having a central directory that sits external to your plans for any contact details. So within your communications part of your plan, have reference to where we can find all the contact information for our key internal and external interested parties. I would avoid where you can, including that in the body of the plan if you don't have the program in place to make sure that we're reviewing the plans consistently to keep them up to date. At the end of the day, it's all about what do our plan users want to engage with. Write your plan and organise your plan to give them what they need right now, and then tell the story of the response. If we have physical plans with numbered pages, keep it to a manageable number of pages that your teams are actually going to engage with, so we don't just end up with a document that sits on a shelf gathering dust. I've seen 1,001 of those. If people are only going to engage with 2, 3, 4, 5 pages, give them that to start with. Have reference to where they can find the additional information, and you might have a chunkier plan that sits a little bit separately that your teams can get into once we're in a more of a settling down phase. Maybe consider starting off with placemats or some key information that's kept on the back of your lanyards even. If that is what the team is going to engage with, give them it to start off with, and then reference where they can find the additional information. We want to make sure at all times they're going to pick up the plan, follow that process, not deviate from the process or make it up as they go along because the plan is too dense and they don't feel that they can tackle it in a speedy way that they would like to as part of their response. So that was an absolute whistle-stop tour through business continuity planning or wider response planning. If anybody has any questions at all, please do pop them into the questions box that Becca mentioned at the start of the webinar, and I'll try to answer those. And for any of you who are popping offline now, thank you very much for listening. Feel free to get in touch by LinkedIn, or my email is just gillian@planbconsulting.com. Happy to chat further about any key concerns within your own organisation or your own team response plans. But thank you very much for attending today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for that, Gillian. We haven't got any questions just yet. I'll just leave it another minute or so just to see if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Sure, no problem.
No, it looks like you explained everything so well. No one has any questions. So we'll end it there.
Okay, happy Friday, everybody, and have a lovely weekend.
Perfect. Thanks, Gillian. Thanks, everyone else, for listening in and asking questions. As I mentioned earlier, you'll receive a recording of the webinar later today, and this will be emailed to you via GoToWebinar. Just to let you know, we have 2 webinars scheduled in for next week, one on Monday and one on Friday, and you can find further information on these via our website. There'll be a short feedback survey after the webinar has finished. If you could just complete that, that would be really appreciated, just so we could get a bit of feedback on how these webinars are going. So thanks again for joining us, and I hope you all have a lovely weekend.